friends, I gather there's a large number here, and that's wonderful because Lily Montagu, of course, was such a seminal person in the establishment of liberal Judaism in the United Kingdom, and indeed in some of the institutions to do with liberal Judaism across the world. And I have to confess, I was brought up in the Reform movement, at least from the age of about 10. I was brought up in Southwest Essex Reform Synagogue, and I never heard of Lily Montagu, to my shame, until I was well into my rabbinate, really. And I think this is true of so many women's part in history, that they are just forgotten about as the years go by, and their influence and their participation and their involvement in movements and what they've achieved, their achievements, are just almost forgotten and wiped out of history. So I'm delighted that I was brought face to face, more or less, with Lily Montagu. Serving at West Central, it was face to face because we had a wonderful portrait of her downstairs in the Montagu Centre. And I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit about her tonight with you. But I always feel that it's important to understand something of the historical context in which people are living and contributing to society. So one has to remember that there was something called the Match Girls strike in 1888. Very famous industrial action by women and teenage girls working at the Bryant and Mac and May factory in Bow. The strike was caused by poor working conditions, 14-hour work days, poor pay, excessive fines if they did anything wrong, even if they just left their post for a second, and severe health complications of working with white phosphorus, such as phossy jaw. And the strike was actually sparked by the dismissal of one of the workers in 1888. And this gives you an idea of what conditions must have been like in the factories there. Yes, you can see. And then the other industrial area where women were working so hard was in the schmutter trade. Remembering the conditions of work at the end of the 19th century, Lily Montagu later wrote, "The wages of women and girls were so low, it's not surprising that they regarded their working life as a temporary evil rather than as a career which was desirable to be as efficient as possible. Girls, or at any rate Jewish girls, were expected to marry, and they often married for the sake of deliverance from the crushing circumstances of their lives. Most of my girls," and do note how she says they're my girls, "in the early years of the club were tailoresses in domestic workshops. The employers had to carry on their work near the big, fashionable West End retail shops. Rents were inordinately high, so it was necessary to live near the shop, so the rooms had to be used for living and working. Average working hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, an hour for dinner, half an hour for tea. In hot weather," and I love this bit, "the men often worked stripped to the waist." Disgusting, isn't it, really? "And the atmosphere created by overheated bodies was anything but pleasant. Many of our girls worked for very long hours as dressmakers and milliners. It seemed remarkable that children could survive the strain of such protracted sedentary occupation." So that was the industrial conditions that faced Lily in her society. And then, of course, there was the politics going on in that stage. 1918, Parliament finally passed an act granting the vote to women. They had to be over the age of 30 and householders, or the wives of householders, occupiers of property with an annual rent of £5, or graduates of British universities. And the questions that were around the suffragette movement drew attention to the marginal role of women in synagogues. Now, it was in 1912, in November, that the Jewish League for Women Suffragettes, the only Jewish organization in England, indeed in the world, I think, that was devoted exclusively to obtaining both national and Jewish suffrage for women, was founded. And Lily Montagu, though books I've read have not indicated that she was, out there chaining herself to the railings, as some of the suffragettes did, still, she joined that movement very quickly. By 1913, there were over 300 members of that women's suffragette movement. And as I said, it drew attention not only to the need for women to have votes, but also that women should be treated properly in synagogue life as well. And then, of course, there was the good old Jack the Ripper. Fear of uncontrolled sexuality of the poor. Recently, interestingly enough, I think, research indicates that the victims of Jack the Ripper were not actually prostitutes, but homeless people, homeless women. So, difficult politics, Jack the Ripper, the social conditions, and then there was immigration. Nathan Adler, the chief rabbi for 35 years until 1880, wrote of the refugees, most of them are lost without livelihoods. It's difficult for them to support themselves and their households, and at times they contravene the will of their maker on account of poverty and overwork, and violate the Sabbath and festivals. Some have been ensnared in the net of missionaries and renounced their religion. May the merciful save us. Woe to the eyes which see and to the ears which hear such things. Moreover, the new Jewish settlers were different. They had different languages, dress, and social and religious habits. They were obvious on English streets. The settled Jewish community, only recently enfranchised in 1858, were worried. It stirred up anti-Semitism, as you can see from this cartoon. It looks awfully modern, doesn't it, apart from the dress? The challenge was therefore to help the immigrants to assimilate to English ways as quickly as possible, while at the same time making sure that they retained their identity and faith. And her father, Lily's father, Samuel Montagu, was a driving force in attempting to meet this challenge. Then there was the growth of the Reform movement in Germany. West London Synagogue, you may remember, was founded in 1842. But until the 20th century, in fact, changes in the services were minimal. This is a picture of David W. Marks, Rabbi David W. Marks, who was the first rabbi of West London Synagogue. And he was basically a Torah fundamentalist. In Europe, they were beginning in this period, and just beginning, to acknowledge the notion of a documentary hypothesis, that is, higher criticism, acknowledging that the Torah was written over a long period of time in different areas by different people. And that really developed in Germany from the 1860s onwards. But West London was already founded by then. In fact, I have in my possession one of the Haggadot that Rabbi Marx produced. And it was absolutely appalling. I can't imagine anyone sitting around a table enjoying this Haggadah or Seder night. He wasn't in favor of rabbinic Judaism very much. He liked Torah and the Psalms. So you were expected to sit all night at Seder reciting Psalms. No four questions, no singing of the four sons or anything like that. And the synagogue, West London Synagogue, people walked mostly to shul on Shabbat. In fact, that was the reason why West London was founded, because the women in their crinoline dresses didn't want to walk from the West End, where they now live, to the East End of London to go to shul. The roads were too messy and muddy. They had a few things like suggestions of changes. They had one day of Chag, of festival, because that's, after all, what's in the Bible. Very few changes in the liturgy. It was based mostly on Sephardi liturgy. The only English prayer was for the royal family and the sermon. Eventually, the Haftarah and the Torah readings were actually short. And of course, there was separate seating for men and women. And you can see here how the ark used to be before they put the extra seating in the front. Beautiful. And in front of the ark would have been the bimah in the center of the synagogue, facing the ark, as in most traditional synagogues. In fact, the synagogue had separate seating on Shabbat until the Second World War. And on the festivals, on the main festivals, the women sat upstairs until I arrived on the scene. I didn't rebel. I was very good. I read a little bit on the bimah and then was allowed upstairs to sit right at the top of the gallery. It was a wonderful view. But women thought this was a bit odd, I think. And within a few years of my appearing at the synagogue, there was mixed seating on the High Holy Days as well. But you can see West London Synagogue wasn't offering much in the way of radical change at that period. And there was an appetite for reform, for religious reform, even from some of the Orthodox rabbis, and certainly their members, and some of the members of West London and other completely disengaged families. And this is how West London Synagogue used to look before, as I said, they put the seating in the middle there. And you can see the decoration as it was in the synagogue before the decorations were damaged in the Second World War. And the last sort of area that one should look at here is philosophy. But this, of course, is the period of Charles Darwin and his attack on religious ideas. And that too, Lily Montagu must have heard about, must have read about, and surely influenced her thought. Now, her childhood, it was part of what we call the cousinhood. She was the sixth of 10 children. Her father was Samuel Montagu, who was a millionaire, a banker, eventually a Liberal MP, and eventually in the House of Lords, first Baron Swatheley. Obviously, her mother, in the words of Lily, remained faithful all her life to Orthodox observances, both great and small. Mother's religious ideas were, though Lily said, a bit elastic. Be allowed English prayers in their home worship. Be allowed spontaneous prayers rather than just stuff from a siddur. And most importantly, unlike her husband, she believed that you could not expect young people to follow the pattern of a life that was identical with previous generations. This is a caricature of her father in Vanity Fair. She said, during the loving understanding of her mother, because during 40 years of my life, I've been called mother by a vast number of girls and women. This is Lily writing about her club. I feel I owe much of my power to win the confidence of my children from having as my model the mother who throughout her life had no greater pleasure than that of sharing her children's interest and whose faith in God was expressed in every detail of her life. Now, she had a deep personal religious and sense of communion with God. When she was little, she had nightmares, and her mother would say, you know, your father is such a good person. God would not take your father from his little girl. So don't worry. And her father would come in and hold her hand and would say Psalm 23 with her. And it led to Lily having a love of Psalms all her life and a strong belief in God's love and justice. But by 15 years old, she was convinced that orthodoxy offered her and other women little room for religious self-expression. Longing to become closer to God, she found herself unable to do so. As a girl, she'd been given limited religious education, so she didn't know how to pray properly in Hebrew. She had a childlike theology and trust in God. And how could you, she wondered, be part of a worshipping community that ignored your existence? She regularly recited a prayer asking God to teach her to pray and make her grateful for the opportunities to serve God. She enjoyed Bible stories and turned to social service, discovering a means of serving God and giving her a sense of purpose and direction. In fact, it was the time of great changes in the lives of girls in the so-called leisured classes. Their education was too good to allow them to be content with the small home duties, which in another generation had satisfied unmarried girls. Think of the stories of things like, the name has escaped me, but the 19th century women novelists writing about the women going out with their little baskets with little food for the poor. 1890, she was running children's services in the new West End synagogue, and that's a picture of it. She wrote that she discovered how utterly boring the long services were to children. I love this. If they prayed at all, it was that the services should come to a speedy end. She made friends with Reverend Singer of Singer's Prayer Book. He was her religious teacher for many years, dealing with religious questions. He introduced her to the prophets. When she was very ill, he taught her to pray. And he wrote special prayers for the children's services that she took. They had an attendance of around 50 children and mothers. They had a modified Amidah. They left out the burnt offerings, a few psalms, some songs in English, no repetition. And it was indeed a popular thing. Not only that, the chief rabbi, Nathan Adler, wrote an English prayer, there he is, for the service. When they held the first service, indeed, there were 200 people turned up. And for a few years, she held Shabbat afternoon services in Hampstead Synagogue, where, horror of horrors, they had a mixed choir. The more we have, she wrote, the greater our self-questioning, the more severe our responsibility. Now, she actually founded in 1893 with her sisters, Marion and her cousin Beatrice, the West Central Jewish Girls Club. They had no, that's a picture of Beatrice out. They had no model to follow and no training. And just think of the gap between her and the girls she was looking after. She really tried to give the working class Jewish woman an opportunity to develop themselves socially, intellectually, and spiritually. She held Shabbat afternoon services, which she led, concert outings, and the services that she held were brief in English, featured sermons that she gave on topics that she felt were of vital interest, and retained only those prayers that she thought might have meaning for modern Jews. Now, why did she do it in the afternoon? So she wouldn't rival other services that were being offered. It was also a way of avoiding her father's anger and avoiding angering Orthodox authorities. She was not challenging the status quo, not doing anything that Orthodox women were allowed to do. And she used to walk to take the services. She used to help the working class girls and deliberately concentrate on that. And we know an awful lot of this in terms of how she gave to wider society. There was a woman called Levy, who was an early member of the West Central Club, later its leader. And she said that Lily was motivated as a young woman who dreamed and beheld a vision. And she saw, a vision, and she saw her sisters, and they lacked much of what had been bestowed on her. These are wider sisters in society, obviously. They needed guidance and friendship. I mean, quite patronizing, unfortunately, of course, to us anyway. And they lacked much of what had been bestowed on her. They needed guidance and friendship, some to be lifted out of squalor and shown the light. Some seemed mere children forced to become breadwinners. Some ran to and fro in snatch at pleasures that were transitory and left bitterness and disillusionment. Some cried, "Give us opportunities, denied us. We need light space knowledge." Others sat and waited for the world of literature and art. Others feared to tread, for the path seemed strewn with giants who could only be overcome by strength which they lacked. And still others groped towards those frailer than themselves and longed to hold out a helping hand, but knew not how. She cried, "To this vision I consecrate myself. For its fruition I will labor unceasingly. I will break down barriers, establish friendships, and give opportunities. I will share, bind up those who are broken, and I will set before them light and good through a faith in Judaism, so that they have strength wherewith to live." And God blessed her as she awoke. But actually, of course, it began even a little before this, because she'd met numerous girls in the Soho clothing trade. And she knew that they would welcome a club for young ladies. So she took the hint and established something, a social group, in Frith Street for the Jewish girls who worked in the sweatshops of the area. When she had 17 girls coming, they had to find bigger facilities. Classes were formed, and they were taught the things that they'd never learned and had a chance of learning at school. And of course, some of these girls, many of these girls, had come from Russia and Poland, escaping from persecution. And Lily wanted to integrate them into the English way of life. So English classes for foreigners were held. And in a short time, the membership of the club reached 70. And in 1983, the West Central Jewish Club for Working Girls sprang into being. And she believed that low wages, unequal to those of the boys, caused the girls to think of themselves as cheap. They didn't have a sense of responsibility or pride. So she stressed in her educational work skill, aspiration. Many girls in reality were in fact the breadwinners of families, particularly within religious Jewish families where male education was considered of more significance, but only, of course, in religious matters. So the self-worth of these young women had to be developed. As a member of the Women's Industrial Committee, Lily Montagu became the honorary secretary of the club's industrial association, educating young female workers about factory acts and using girls' clubs for industrial organization. In 1911, over policies regarding girls' clubs as a basis for industrial organization, the demand for a minimum wage became very urgent. The beginning of the war, the First World War in 1914, the National Organization of Girls' Clubs organized rooms in Titmarsh Street in London as a relief workroom for the girls. And they were making uniforms there for the army. By 1915, that employment crisis had passed, and the pledges to look after the young ladies for jobs soon disappeared. Now, Lily was really working in an amazing way to look after the working rights, the human rights, the working rights of young women and union materials. And it has been totally forgotten as far as one can see. Just the notion of the work she did was removed from the clubs. Social workers became associated only with the needs of the boys and the men. And she was forgotten as a political activist. Just not appreciated, not in changing the politics of the period. In 1933, she was given an OBE for work with the poor. The club was bombed in 1941 and many of her friends were killed. But the club did continue on in different temporary places. She became one of the first women justices of the peace in her 30s and established in a juvenile court a good relationship with the young people who came before her, especially of the young ladies who were, in the words of the day, in need of care and protection, i.e. they were prostitutes. And we have in the resources, in archives, letters, fan mail, would you believe it, from people that she'd sentenced and who appreciated the way she'd helped them in their life. But of course, for us as liberal and reform Jews, it's her religious work that's most important. She'd been running the Shabbat service, and she'd been running services at the club. They were informal, and she found that not only the children, but their mothers preferred these services to going to shul. It was clear that the formal structure and ritual did not speak to the lives of women and children. So in the 1890s, she met with Claude Montefiore. And he helped her and gave her means and confidence to redefine Judaism so as to allow for the personal growth and expression of women. And this really began her formal break with orthodoxy, leading to an estrangement from her father that lasted until his death. Of course, these are the three M's. There they are: Montefiore, Israel Matter, and Lily Montagu. The three M's. In January 1899, in the issue of the Jewish Quarterly on the spiritual possibilities of Judaism today, she asked all religiously committed Jews to help her form an association aimed at strengthening the religious life of Anglo-Jewish community through the propagation of liberal Jewish teachings with sense of spirituality and personal responsibility to God. Sabbath afternoon worship services conducted along liberal Jewish lines and propaganda meetings. Well, meetings were held, often led by Lily Montagu. Montefiore, of course, volunteered to serve as the group's official leader, because, of course, if it had been led by a woman, no one would have taken notice of it. So you had to have a man in charge. But an awful lot of the work, in fact, the majority, was actually done by Lily Montagu. Claude Montefiore became the president because Lily recognized that that was the only way for things to move forward. She did the work, but he became the figurehead. And she didn't really want to lead official type services to start with. She felt that this would cause a shock to the community. Such a radical change might prove injurious to our cause. Here you have a copy of a sermon that she wrote. I can't read her writing, I'm afraid. You can see, of course, not typed, handwritten, crossed out. Amazing stuff. And here you've got a picture of the other M, Israel Isidore Matter. She did form West Central Liberal Synagogue. Now, there is a little rivalry that goes on between West Central Liberal Synagogue and the LJS. The LJS say that they were the first liberal synagogue in the United Kingdom. As the past rabbi of West Central Liberal Synagogue, I would argue that and say it's been carrying out services for years before that. It's just they weren't called officially a synagogue. But maybe I'm just biased. Though, of course, I'd never admit to it in public. She did hold services in Alfred Place, lectures with over 100 people at present, baby blessings, a religion school for children with her sister. She conducted marriages, funerals, baby blessings, pastoral visiting, a great family atmosphere. Members would write and apologize if they couldn't make a service. Can you believe that? Wouldn't happen today. And all through her sermon, she wanted to make us conscious of God's presence everywhere. And here we have a picture in 1931 of the council of the West Central Liberal Synagogue. I do love their hats. Do you not? She was also responsible for the foundation of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, started in 1926. It was suggested by a club member who wanted to know where other Jews lived and worshipped when they went traveling. So she organized this International World Union Conference in Berlin in 1928. And the service was held in Berlin's Reform Temple. Now, I'm pretty sure that Regina Jonas would have been present at that service, maybe. I'd love to know if they ever met. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence either for or against the meeting, or even whether they actually had any notion of each other's existence. And you can see from the Liberal Jewish Monthly here, Lily Montagu celebrating her 80th birthday. She lived with a great deal of strength in her being. She carried on taking services. She wrote at the time in 1954, "Friends, I have been happy all my life. I want to tell you some of the things that have made me the happiest. And when you are my age, you will see if you agree." What did she name? Her home, Red Lodge, which she shared with her sister Marion. Peace and encouragement. Her siblings, the 10 children that her parents had had, she said her siblings formed a minyan, which could never have been better. And the fact that she was able to translate her faith into life. And she was able to bring a nearness to God into her life. God was incredibly important, and the relationship with God. There was a divine purpose to her life. And that she was able to join with others to spread that word of God through religious work and social work. She noted people you serve give you more than you give them. And she also noticed how wonderful her co-workers. Now, this is the original picture of her Rolls Royce, I must tell you. But when I was at West Central, I heard from one of my members, Eileen Berman, that in 1962, Lily came to visit her in Council Flat in Hackney. And she came with her sister, who didn't want her to travel at her advanced age on public transport, so she insisted on bringing her on pastoral visits in the Rolls Royce with the chauffeur. And the member, Eileen Berman, remembers seeing all the neighbours running out to have a look at this Rolls Royce and see Lily Montagu enter the flat. She was a wonderful person looking after the people's needs of those who were around her. Bertram Jacobs, who was the Leobeck College administrator when I joined the college, came to see a service I took at West Central way back in 1974. And it was before I was qualified. And I went and took the services there for the High Holy Days, because at that point I wasn't allowed to take services at West London. And he looked at me at the bimah and thought, "Oh, you are just like Miss Lily." And I'm still not quite sure whether I should be taking it as a compliment or not. But what's interesting is that actually no women rabbis followed her immediately. We were just not part of that vision. In fact, Rabbi Eli Tikvasera, said that during her lifetime, maybe there was just no room for anyone else. She didn't see herself as a pioneer or a feminist. She saw herself called by God with personal spirituality at her center, following demands of the prophets, seeking solace in the words of the Psalms. Maybe that was already an old-fashioned approach by 1963. Certainly the portrait of her looks very much like a Victorian woman. Maybe by the 1960s, that was just not the sort of person we women rabbis saw as a role model. And so, unfortunately, for many, many years, she was ignored by many, though not, of course, by those brought up in some of the liberal synagogues. I'm pleased to say that they kept her memory well to the fore. So, friends, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
While we wait for some questions, just to say you've had lots of positive comments in the chat, how much everyone enjoyed this. Wonderful, interesting. Lots of people who knew Lily or whose parents or grandparents knew Lily.
I love hearing stories. I mean, really, Rabbi Rachel Montagu should be giving this talk. She must have lots of personal memories of her great aunt.
Okay, a really nice one that's coming from Dean, Jackie. Do you feel that Lily caused a big change within equality within the wider UK, not just within Judaism, but within the UK in general, her work?
She wasn't in the feminist business. You know, she was very much into girls having the right to equal pay, I suppose. It didn't really work. Her work in the, as I said, in the unions was forgotten. That's where she really put a lot of energy into making women have better chance in life. She wanted the individual to have a better chance in life. I'm not quite sure she was that influential on the wider theme, but I'm willing to be contradicted on that.
One from Patricia. How was Marion involved with Lily's work?
She was very helpful. She was by her side. You know, she helped with the religion school. She gave her the big support of living with her and giving her a base from which she could work. And we all know that we need someone at home who can give us confidence and support and make the chicken soup or whatever it is. Actually, Lily was a bit of a vegetarian, so maybe not the chicken soup, but make something else to make you feel that you can go out to work.
Thank you, Rabbi Jackie. The questions are coming in thick and fast now. This is a really good one from Rafi. I think as a rabbi, you quite like to answer this one. What were her main theological advances and how were they viewed by the Orthodox community, both at the time and maybe now?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it, that in the early period, Reverend Singer and Nathan Adler were supportive of what she was doing for children and women, doing services in English, singing songs in English, telling Bible stories. So all of that, she was very supportive. They were very supportive of. It was only later when there was this break from the traditional notion of Torah. And of course, that took a long time to come. As I said, you know, David Wolfe Marks at West London never knew the idea of the Torah as being written over a long period of time. That was, you know, later in the 19th century than he was. And West London, there weren't really major changes for a very long time until the 20th century. So she did bring the theological. She brought the theological changes of knowing that God had to be at the center. But she was very traditional in her way. For many years, I think, she walked on Shabbat. She was a vegetarian, but maybe that's because that's the way she kept kashrut. She was very anxious not to be controversial in the way she was as far as her relationships with her parents were concerned, until there was that break once she became involved with Liberal Judaism. And then, of course, she was involved and influenced by Montefiore and Matter, who brought with them very radical theological ideas from America. Of the notion that the Torah is not necessarily completely the divine revelation that the Orthodox would feel was there. But I think people would be quite surprised at some of the views that she had. Given the modern world and modern progressive Judaism, the emphasis on God is not one that is really very popular in many progressive worlds today. There's an emphasis on social work, which she would have really appreciated. Tikkun Olam, she would have really got onto that, I'm sure. But in many of our congregations and many of our own lives, I think we've lost this notion of chasing a personal relationship with God, which to her was at the center. And also her views of intermarriage, of course, were very different from ones we now hold today. She felt that people should not marry people of another faith, and that if a Jew and a Christian became enamored of each other, wanted to marry each other, then they should choose to either become Christian or both of them to become Jewish. But you should not try and bring up a child in a mixed faith household. So that's very far. Those are two things that are really very far, the God bit and the intermarriage bit, from where we are today. The notion of Tikkun Olam, I think she would have embraced.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent answer, and I think you've given a preview of term 2 of the Education Hub, and we'll be going through some of those. One quick last question for you, because we've got to wrap up in 1 minute, from Anthony. We heard last week about Claude Montefiore and some of the anti-Zionism that was around in the early liberal movement. Did Lily Montagu share that?
Do you know, I don't know. I've never read anything in her works that seemed to be particularly pro-Zion. She was very influenced by Claude Montefiore. And when I grew up, I never really went to synagogue till I was about 10, for various reasons in my personal life. And we went to Southwest Essex Reform Synagogue. And I remember that the prayer for the state of Israel was not in the Reform prayer book at that time, but was pasted into the back of the book, so that it could be read if you wanted to, but it could be ignored as well. So, and that was in the that would have been in the 1960s. So I don't think this notion of being particularly pro-Zion was around in her lifetime.
Fantastic.
That was interesting. Simon, thank you, Simon. And I think that's probably true. Simon Montagu has said that she was anti-Zionist because she wanted to form the Jewish world to bring the future of a good messianic future, if you like, to the whole of the world, not just to Israel. The old Reform position. Absolutely.
Like everyone just said, massive thank you to Rabbi Dr. Jackie Tabick today. I think, and you can see from the comments in the chat how fascinating everyone found this, how brilliant it's been. We've had 2 fantastic education hubs now, and please join us again next week. So thank you very much, Rabbi Jackie.
And thank you for being there.